The myth of the deadly kiss. On the distant planet of Venus, a chilling legend was whispered in hushed tones. Travelers and traders alike spoke of a creature so beautiful that one glance could leave you breathless. Her name was Lyria, an alien woman of unmatched grace and allure. But her beauty was not what made her infamous, it was her kiss. Legends said that Lyria's kiss was deadly, a venomous touch that had claimed the lives of many who dared to get too close. No one knew the truth of how or why it happened, but the stories were clear. Men from all across the galaxy had tried to win her heart, only to meet a grim end. Her victims were left pale and lifeless, their expressions frozen in a mix of fear and ecstasy. Lyria herself was said to live in a cursed forest, hidden away from the rest of the world, where she awaited her next victim. Adrian, a human explorer, had heard these tales before. Sitting in a dimly lit bar on a nearby moon, he listened as the locals spun their warnings about Venus and the deadly kiss. "You'd be a fool to go there, human," a grizzled alien with 3 eyes warned him. "That woman isn't a legend. She's real. I've seen the bodies. Dozens of them." Adrian leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk on his face. "A beautiful woman whose kiss can kill. Sounds like a story made to keep nosy people away." The alien slammed his drink down, his eyes narrowing. "You think this is a joke? I lost a brother to her. He went there thinking he could charm her, like every other idiot who thought they were special. She kissed him, and he never came back." Despite the warnings, Adrian wasn't the type to believe in fairy tales. A seasoned adventurer, he had faced all kinds of dangers in his travels. Pirates, deadly creatures, and even the vacuum of space itself. A mysterious woman in a forest wasn't enough to scare him. His confidence would soon be tested. 2 weeks later, Adrian's ship was caught in a violent storm as he flew over Venus. The planet's atmosphere was unpredictable, filled with electrical storms and dense clouds that blocked navigation. His ship shook violently, alarms blaring as systems began to fail. "Hold together," Adrian muttered, gripping the controls tightly. But it was no use. The storm ripped through his ship's engines, and with a deafening roar, he was forced to crash land on the planet's surface. The landing wasn't gentle. Adrian's head throbbed as he crawled out of the wreckage, coughing from the smoke that billowed from his ship. Around him, the forest loomed, towering trees with glowing leaves and vines that seemed to pulse like living veins. The air was thick and humid, carrying a faint, sweet scent that made him dizzy. He checked his equipment, relieved to find that most of it was intact. His communicator, however, was useless. Stranded and with no way to call for help, Adrian knew he had to find shelter and resources. As he surveyed his surroundings, a strange sensation prickled the back of his neck, as if he were being watched. "Great," he muttered. "First a crash, now I'm being stalked." Hours passed as Adrian navigated the forest, his instincts on high alert. The beauty of the landscape was undeniable, but it was a dangerous beauty. The ground was littered with bones, small ones at first, likely from animals, but as he ventured deeper, he noticed larger skeletons. Humanoid remains, stripped clean of flesh, lay scattered among the roots of the trees. Adrian felt a chill run down his spine. Maybe there was some truth to the stories after all. As dusk fell, the forest came alive with eerie sounds. Chirps, growls, and whispers filled the air, but one noise stood out, a soft, melodic hum. It was hauntingly beautiful, like a lullaby carried on the wind. Adrian followed the sound, drawn to it despite the warning bells ringing in his head. He reached a clearing bathed in the soft glow of bioluminescent plants. At the center stood a figure, a woman. She was unlike anything Adrian had ever seen. Her skin shimmered like liquid silver, and her eyes glowed a soft, hypnotic blue. Long, flowing hair cascaded down her back, and her lips, full and inviting, were a deep, intoxicating shade of violet. Adrian froze, his breath catching in his throat. She was beautiful, yes, but there was something otherworldly about her, something dangerous. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice steady despite the unease he felt. The woman tilted her head, studying him with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and sadness. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice soft but firm. Adrian took a cautious step forward. "I didn't exactly plan this. My ship crashed. I'm just trying to survive." Her gaze flicked to the wreckage in the distance, then back to him. "Survive? Then you should leave this place as soon as you can." "Not much of a choice right now," Adrian replied. "Besides, you don't seem as scary as the stories make you out to be." At this, the woman's expression darkened. "The stories are true, human. My kiss is a curse, and it has claimed more lives than I care to remember. If you value yours, you'll stay far away from me." Despite her warning, Adrian couldn't bring himself to leave. There was something in her voice, a sorrow that tugged at his heart. She wasn't a monster. She was trapped, just like him. The legend of the deadly kiss was real, and Adrian was about to discover just how dangerous it could be. A temptation like no other. Adrian sat by the glowing embers of a makeshift fire, his back against a moss-covered tree. The thick forest around him seemed alive, its strange flora and faintly glowing vines shifting gently as if breathing. Every now and then, his eyes darted toward the figure standing just beyond the firelight. Lyria. She kept her distance, watching him with an intensity that was equal parts curiosity and caution. Her silver skin shimmered faintly under the pale light of Venus's twin moons, and her glowing blue eyes never left him. "You should have left," Lyria said, her voice soft yet carrying an undeniable weight. Adrian leaned forward, poking at the fire with a stick. "I tried. The forest is a maze. Keeps leading me back here." "That's not the forest," she said. "It's me." He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You're keeping me here." Her gaze dropped, guilt flickering across her face. "Not on purpose. You're drawn to me, like the others were. It's instinctive. My kind developed it as a defense mechanism. By the time they realize what's happening, it's too late." Adrian chuckled dryly, a sound that seemed to catch her off guard. "Well, congratulations. I'm still alive, so maybe your magic doesn't work on humans." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You shouldn't joke. You don't understand what I've done, what I caused. Your confidence will kill you." Adrian shrugged. "I've been told that before. Still here, though." Lyria's frustration was visible, but beneath it, there was something else. Fascination. This human was different. Every other creature she had encountered had been either paralyzed by fear or overcome with blind desire. Adrian was neither. "What are you even doing here, human?" she asked, her tone softer now. Adrian sighed and leaned back against the tree. "Looking for answers, I guess, or running from them. Doesn't make much difference anymore." She frowned, her curiosity deepening. "Running from what?" Adrian's eyes flicked up to meet hers, a faint shadow of pain in his gaze. "Mistakes. People I couldn't save." He shifted, brushing off the melancholy like dust. "But enough about me. What's your story, Lyria? How does someone end up cursed with a deadly kiss?" Her name on his lips startled her, and for a moment, she was silent. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, almost fragile. "It's not a curse. It's biology. My kind, we were engineered to protect ourselves, to be untouchable. The kiss, as you call it, was meant to be a defense, a way to survive. But we didn't ask for it." Adrian tilted his head, interest piqued. "Engineered? By who?" She shook her head, her silver hair catching the moonlight. "It doesn't matter anymore. They're gone. All of them. I'm the last." The words hung in the air, heavy with loss. Adrian felt a pang of sympathy, but he didn't let it show. "Must get lonely," he said casually, tossing the stick into the fire. Her laugh was unexpected. Soft, almost bitter. "Lonely doesn't even begin to cover it. But it's better this way. I don't want anyone else to die because of me." Adrian stood and dusted off his pants, his movements deliberate. "You talk like you're dangerous, but you saved me. You could have let me die when I crashed." Lyria's glowing eyes narrowed slightly. "Don't mistake kindness for safety. I may not want to hurt you, but that doesn't mean I won't." He took a step closer, just enough to test her reaction. She didn't move, but her body tensed, like a coiled spring. "You're not as dangerous as you think," Adrian said, his voice calm but firm. "If you were, I'd be dead already." Her breath hitched, the faintest crack in her composed facade. "You don't understand what you're doing, human. The closer you get, the harder it will be to stop." Adrian smiled faintly, his usual charm glinting through. "Then maybe you should stop me." The silence between them was electric, the firelight flickering across their faces. Lyria's gaze burned into him, her expression a mix of frustration, confusion, and something she couldn't quite name. "You're either very brave," she said finally, "or very foolish." Adrian's smirk widened. "A little of both, probably." For the first time in years, Lyria felt something stir within her. A dangerous, impossible hope. She turned away quickly, her voice sharper now. "Get some rest. You'll need your strength if you're going to survive this forest." Adrian watched her retreat into the shadows, her silhouette fading into the glowing trees. Despite her warnings, he felt no fear, only a growing determination to uncover the truth behind her sorrow, her curse, and the strange bond forming between them. The forest around him seemed quieter now, as if it, too, was holding its breath. The strange bond. The days on Venos passed slowly, marked by the soft hum of the alien forest and the unspoken tension between Adrian and Lyria. Despite her warnings, Adrian hadn't left her side. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or maybe something deeper, something neither of them could name. Lyria kept her distance, watching him like a predator assessing a threat, but Adrian didn't seem to care. He treated her like any other companion, offering dry humor, sharing stories of Earth, and occasionally teasing her about the deadly reputation she carried. "You don't strike me as a legendary killer, you know," he said one morning, breaking the silence as they walked through a stretch of glowing moss. His boots left faint impressions on the vibrant ground. Lyria glanced at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And you don't strike me as someone who values his life." Adrian grinned, undeterred. "Touché. But you saved me from that beast last night, didn't you? Doesn't seem very lethal of you." The memory flashed in her mind. A predator had emerged from the shadows, its multi-jawed maw snapping dangerously close to Adrian's neck. Without thinking, Lyria had acted, her sharp claws cutting through the creature's thick hide before it could strike. "I didn't save you for your sake," she said flatly. "If you died, I'd have to drag your body back to the crash site. Too much effort." "Sure," Adrian replied, clearly unconvinced. "Whatever helps you sleep at night." Her irritation was evident, but she didn't respond. There was something maddeningly persistent about Adrian. He wasn't like the others who had come before him. They'd been blinded by desire, consumed by her presence until their own folly led to their deaths. But Adrian, he treated her like a person, not an object of fascination or fear. It was disarming. That evening, they camped by a shallow, shimmering stream. Adrian crouched by the water's edge, washing dirt off his face, while Lyria perched on a rock nearby, her silver skin reflecting the moonlight. "You never told me about your people," Adrian said, breaking the silence. "The ones who engineered you." Lyria's gaze remained on the water, her voice distant. "They were scientists, geneticists. They created me to be perfect. Beauty without flaw, instincts sharpened to survive anything. But they didn't account for the curse they built into me." Adrian tilted his head, intrigued. "The kiss." She nodded, her expression unreadable. "It wasn't supposed to be deadly. It was meant to be a deterrent, a defense mechanism that activated under extreme stress. But something went wrong. I couldn't control it. The stronger the bond, the more fatal the reaction." That's twisted, Adrian said softly. They turned you into a weapon. Her eyes flicked to him, a flicker of something vulnerable breaking through her guarded exterior. I didn't ask for this. I didn't want to live this way. Isolated, untouchable. Adrian was quiet for a moment, the crackling fire between them the only sound. Then he spoke, his voice steady. Maybe they built you to survive, but that doesn't mean you have to be alone. Curses can be broken. Lyria scoffed lightly. And what makes you think you can break mine, human? Adrian leaned back, resting his arms on the ground. Because I'm still here. And because I'm not afraid of you. Her sharp laugh echoed through the clearing, a sound that carried both amusement and disbelief. You should be afraid. You're either incredibly brave or hopelessly reckless. Or maybe, Adrian said, smirking, I'm just too stubborn to give up. Over the following days, something shifted between them. Their conversations grew less guarded, the silences between words more comfortable. Adrian began to notice the little things about Lyria. The way her glowing eyes softened when she smiled, the way her voice wavered when she spoke about her past. Lyria, in turn, found herself drawn to Adrian's relentless optimism, his refusal to see her as a monster. He didn't flinch when she spoke of her deadly history, nor did he try to exploit her abilities like others had. One night, as they sat beneath the twin moons, Adrian produced a small, battered harmonica from his pocket. What's that? Lyria asked, tilting her head. It's called a harmonica, Adrian said, blowing a few notes. Not much of an instrument, but it's good for passing the time. The sound was strange and haunting, the melody weaving through the alien forest like a ghost. Lyria listened, her eyes closed, the music stirring something deep within her. When he finished, she opened her eyes, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. Play another, she said quietly. And so he did, the simple tunes filling the night air, bridging the unspoken distance between them. For the first time in years, Lyria felt something she thought she'd lost forever. Hope. Adrian might have been foolish, reckless, and stubborn, but he was also something else entirely. Human. And perhaps, against all odds, that was exactly what she needed. The scientist's revelation. Adrian crouched in the hollowed-out remains of his ship, surrounded by flickering screens and sparking wires. The crash had left most of the systems in ruins, but the diagnostic equipment in the medical bay was still operational, barely. It hummed faintly as he fed a new sample into the analyzer, a droplet of Lyria's shimmering, silver-tinted blood. Lyria leaned against the ship's doorway, her arms crossed. She watched him with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity, her glowing eyes scanning the chaos around him. You're wasting your time, she said. My condition isn't something you can fix with a machine. Adrian didn't look up. Maybe, but it doesn't hurt to try. It does, she replied sharply, her voice carrying an edge of bitterness. I've seen others try to help. They all failed, and they died for it. Adrian turned to her, his expression calm but resolute. I'm not like them, and I'm not afraid of your curse. Her lips tightened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she moved closer, her movements cautious, as if even her proximity might harm him. Why do you even care? What do you gain from this? Adrian paused, his hands resting on the edge of the console. Because no one deserves to live like this. Alone. Afraid to touch anyone. I've seen enough suffering in this universe to know when it's time to push back. For a moment, Lyria said nothing, her gaze lingering on his face. There was something about him, a stubborn, reckless spark that made him different. She hated it, and she couldn't help but admire it. The analyzer beeped, breaking the tension. Adrian leaned forward, studying the screen as lines of data scrolled past, his brow furrowed as he read. Interesting. What? Lyria asked, stepping closer despite herself. Adrian pointed at the screen. Your blood. It's not just venom. There's something else. A mineral compound, something I've never seen before. It's interacting with your body in ways that don't make sense. Almost like. Like what? Lyria pressed, her voice sharp with impatience. Like it's alive, Adrian said, his tone tinged with wonder. This mineral, whatever it is, might be the key to your condition. It's not just a defense mechanism. It's more like an overactive immune response. Lyria's face darkened. You're saying my body is fighting off anyone who gets too close, that it sees people as threats. Adrian nodded. Exactly. But here's the thing. If we can find a way to neutralize that response, it might stop the lethal side effects. Her gaze narrowed. And how do you plan to do that? Adrian scratched the back of his neck, a sheepish grin spreading across his face. Well, that's the tricky part. I'd need to introduce something into your system that your body doesn't reject. Something compatible. Like what? She interrupted, her tone sharp. Adrian hesitated before answering. Like human DNA. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. Lyria stared at him, her expression unreadable. You want to experiment on me? No, Adrian said quickly, raising his hands defensively. I'm not talking about some Frankenstein-level madness. This would be subtle, careful, something to help your body adapt, not change who you are. Lyria shook her head, stepping back. You don't understand what you're suggesting. This isn't a puzzle you can solve, Adrian. People have died trying to fix me. You think you're any different? I know I am, he said firmly, standing to face her. Because I'm not afraid of you, and I'm not giving up on you. Her glowing eyes burned into his, a storm of emotions swirling within them. Anger, fear, and something else she couldn't name. You're playing with fire, human, she said softly. You'll end up like the rest of them. Adrian stepped closer, his voice lowering. Maybe I will. But if there's even a chance I can help you, isn't it worth trying? For the first time in years, Lyria felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel. Hope. It was dangerous, reckless, and utterly terrifying. But as she looked into Adrian's determined eyes, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, he was right. A risky experiment. Adrian stood in the middle of the forest clearing, his hands clutching a small vial of glowing liquid. The serum inside shimmered faintly, catching the light of the twin moons overhead. It was a mixture of his own DNA and the strange mineral compound extracted from Lyria's blood. A desperate gamble to neutralize the deadly reaction her body triggered. Lyria stood a few steps away, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. She didn't like this. She didn't like any of this. You realize this could kill you, she said, her voice as cold as the night air. Adrian smirked, tucking the vial into a compartment on his belt. You've mentioned that. A lot. Starting to think you're just trying to scare me off. I'm not, she said sharply, stepping closer. This isn't a game, Adrian. If your theory is wrong, your body won't just reject the serum. It could trigger my curse faster than ever. You wouldn't stand a chance. He shrugged, his easygoing demeanor only irritating her further. If it doesn't work, I'll die knowing I tried to help you. Better than sitting around doing nothing. Lyria shook her head, her silver hair catching the moonlight. You're infuriating, you know that. Adrian grinned. You've mentioned that too. Despite herself, Lyria felt a flicker of admiration for him. He was reckless, stubborn, and entirely too optimistic for his own good, but he was also the only person who had ever seen her as more than just a monster. Fine, she said finally, her voice tight. If we're doing this, we do it my way. No shortcuts, no unnecessary risks. Adrian raised an eyebrow. This whole thing is an unnecessary risk. Lyria glared at him, and for a moment, the air between them felt electric. Just don't die, she muttered, turning away. They set up a makeshift lab near a stream, using Adrian's salvaged equipment and the resources Lyria had gathered from the forest. The serum was ready, but the process to administer it was anything but simple. Adrian needed to introduce the serum directly into his bloodstream, while in close proximity to Lyria. Her presence would trigger the venomous reaction, and the serum would act as a buffer, if it worked. Lyria watched as Adrian prepared the injector, her chest tight with anxiety. "Last chance to back out," she said, her voice low. Adrian glanced up, his grin softer this time. "You're not getting rid of me that easily." He pressed the injector to his arm and pulled the trigger. The serum entered his bloodstream in a burst of cold fire, and Adrian staggered, his body reacting immediately. "Adrian!" Lyria stepped forward, instinctively reaching for him before pulling back. "I'm fine," he gasped, gripping the edge of the table for support. "Just give it a second." Seconds stretched into minutes, and the forest around them seemed to hold its breath. Lyria could feel the change in the air, her body reacting to Adrian's proximity. The familiar, dangerous pull of her curse began to stir, but it was different this time. Less overwhelming, less volatile. Adrian straightened, his breathing steadying. "It's working," he said, his voice filled with quiet awe. Lyria stepped closer, her movements cautious. She could feel it too, the strange harmony between them. Her curse wasn't gone, but it was subdued, tamed by the serum coursing through Adrian's veins. "Adrian," she whispered, her voice trembling. He looked up at her, his expression soft. "See, told you it was worth the risk." But before she could respond, his legs buckled, and he collapsed to the ground. "Adrian." Lyria dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his unconscious form. She didn't dare touch him. Not yet. The serum had worked, for now. But the strain on his body was greater than she'd anticipated. As she watched his shallow breathing, a mix of emotions crashed over her. Relief, fear, and a pang of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Hope. Lyria clenched her fists, determination hardening her expression. If Adrian was willing to risk everything for her, she couldn't let his efforts be in vain. For the first time in her life, she felt the weight of something she never thought she'd have, a connection. And she was determined to protect it, no matter the cost. The deadly kiss. Adrian stirred, his eyelids heavy as consciousness slowly returned. The forest around him was eerily silent, the faint glow of bioluminescent plants casting an otherworldly light across the clearing. Above him, Lyria's face came into focus, her glowing blue eyes filled with worry, and something he couldn't quite place. "You're awake," she said softly, her voice a mixture of relief and tension. Adrian managed a weak grin. "Couldn't let you have all the fun without me." Lyria frowned, sitting back on her heels. "You're reckless. Stupid, even. That serum could have killed you." "But it didn't," Adrian said, pushing himself up with a groan. "And more importantly, it worked. I can feel it." Lyria hesitated, her gaze searching his face. She could feel it too, the strange shift in the air between them. The deadly pull of her curse was still there, but it was muted, no longer the uncontrollable force that had haunted her for years. "You shouldn't feel so confident yet," she said, her tone sharp. "This isn't over. We don't know how long the effects will last, or if they'll hold under stress." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "Stress? You mean like you trying to kill me?" Her lips twitched, almost forming a smile, but the tension in her expression remained. "This isn't a joke, Adrian. The serum is untested. If something goes wrong..." She trailed off, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Adrian's grin faded, and he reached out, his hand hovering near hers. "Then we figure it out together. I didn't come this far to back down now." For a moment, Lyria didn't move. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of fear and longing warring within her. She'd spent so long pushing people away, convinced that her touch, her very existence, was a death sentence. But Adrian wasn't afraid. He was here, and he wasn't leaving. "Lyria," Adrian said, his voice softer now, "you've been fighting this alone for too long. Let me help you. Trust me." Her glowing eyes met his, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope. Slowly, she reached out, her hand brushing against his. The reaction was immediate. A surge of energy shot through her, the familiar pull of her curse igniting, but it didn't overwhelm her. The serum's effects held, creating a fragile balance between them. Adrian's breath hitched, but he didn't pull away. "See," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in his body. "It's working." Lyria's hand trembled, her fear threatening to consume her. "We shouldn't push this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But Adrian shook his head. "If we don't test it now, we'll never know if it's enough. This is your chance to break free, Lyria. Don't let fear hold you back." Her gaze hardened, and she nodded, steeling herself. Slowly, cautiously, she leaned closer, her silver hair cascading around them like a veil. Adrian's heart pounded, but he held his ground. This wasn't just about the serum. It was about trust, about proving that her curse didn't define her. Their faces were inches apart now, the air between them crackling with tension. Lyria hesitated, her lips hovering just above his. "If this goes wrong." "It won't," Adrian said firmly. "I trust you." With a deep breath, she closed the distance, her lips brushing against his in the faintest of touches. Time seemed to stop. For a moment, there was nothing but the warmth of their connection, the fragile hope that they might have found a way to defy the odds. Then the reaction began. Adrian's body tensed as a wave of heat coursed through him, the serum in his veins working overtime to counteract the effects of Lyria's venom. She pulled back, panic flashing across her face. "Adrian," she cried, her hands hovering near his shoulders. "What's happening?" He gasped, his breaths shallow as the tension in his body slowly eased. "It's okay," he said between breaths. "It's holding. I can feel it." Lyria stared at him, her hands trembling. "Are you sure?" Adrian nodded, a faint smile forming on his lips. "I'm sure. Looks like your kiss isn't so deadly after all." The weight in her chest lifted, replaced by a flood of relief and something she hadn't felt in years: joy. She reached out again, this time without hesitation, her hand brushing against his cheek. For the first time, her touch didn't bring death. Tears filled her eyes, and she let out a shaky laugh. "You're insane, you know that." Adrian chuckled weakly. "Yeah, but it worked, didn't it?" Lyria nodded, her tears spilling over. It worked. The forest around them seemed to sigh in relief, the bioluminescent plants glowing brighter, as if celebrating their victory. But deep down, both of them knew this was only the beginning. Love beyond logic. The dawn broke softly over the alien forest, painting the sky with hues of gold and lavender. Adrian sat on a smooth rock by the stream, the faint hum of the bioluminescent plants fading as the first rays of sunlight bathed the clearing. His body still felt weak, the strain of the experiment evident in his movements, but he was alive, and that was more than he could have hoped for. Lyria stood nearby, her silver skin glowing faintly even in the daylight. Her gaze was fixed on him, a mixture of awe and disbelief in her luminous eyes. "You're really okay," she said, almost to herself, as if speaking the words might undo their truth. Adrian turned to her, a small, tired smile playing on his lips. "Told you I'm tougher than I look." Lyria shook her head, her expression softening. "You're reckless, foolish, and extraordinary." He chuckled, wincing slightly at the ache in his ribs. "Careful, Lyria." That almost sounded like a compliment. She moved closer, her steps hesitant but steady. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to keep her distance, to protect him from the curse she had lived with for so long. But the pull was different now, not deadly, but warm, comforting. "I'd spent my whole life believing I was a danger to anyone who got too close," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "that I was meant to be alone. But you changed that." Adrian tilted his head, his smile fading into something more serious. "You're not a monster, Lyria. You never were. They made you believe that, but it's not true." Her chest tightened at his words, the sincerity in his voice breaking through walls she had built over years of isolation. "And what about you?" she asked, her gaze searching his. "What happens to you now?" "The serum worked, but it's not permanent. You can't stay here, Adrian. This place, it's not your world." Adrian looked out at the forest, the alien beauty of it, both captivating and surreal. "You're right," he said finally. "This isn't my world. But maybe I've found something here worth staying for." Lyria's breath caught, her glowing eyes widening. "Adrian, you don't." "I do," he interrupted, his voice firm. "You think I risked everything just to walk away now? You've spent your whole life running from who you are, but you don't have to do it alone anymore. We can figure this out together." The sincerity in his words left her speechless. For so long, she had believed that her existence was a burden, a curse she had to bear in solitude. But Adrian saw her differently. He saw her as someone worth fighting for. Lyria took a step closer, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch his face. When her fingers brushed his skin, there was no pain, no reaction, just warmth. She let out a shaky breath, tears welling in her eyes. "You're insane," she whispered, a faint smile breaking through her tears. Adrian grinned. "You keep saying that, but I think you're starting to like it." She laughed softly, the sound light and unrestrained. It felt foreign, yet freeing, as if a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had been lifted. "Maybe I am," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I'm starting to believe you." Adrian reached up, his hand covering hers as it rested against his cheek. "Good," he said, "because I'm not going anywhere." The forest seemed to breathe with them, the glowing flora pulsing faintly as if sharing in their newfound connection. For the first time, Lyria felt truly seen, not as a danger, not as a curse, but as herself. Later that day, they stood at the edge of the clearing, where the forest began to thin. Beyond it, the rocky terrain stretched toward the distant horizon, where Adrian's damaged ship rested in silence. "What happens now?" Lyria asked, her voice steady, but laced with uncertainty. Adrian shrugged, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "We fix the ship, find a way off this rock, and figure out how to keep your curse in check. Simple, right?" She raised an eyebrow, the corners of her mouth twitching in amusement. "Simple? You really are reckless." "Reckless works for me," he replied. "And besides, I've got you to keep me grounded." Lyria shook her head, but the faint smile on her lips betrayed her amusement. For the first time in years, she felt something she thought she'd never experience again: hope. As they walked toward the horizon, side by side, the forest behind them seemed to shimmer brighter, as if bidding farewell to its most infamous inhabitant. Lyria didn't know what the future held, but with Adrian by her side, she was ready to face it. Together, they would write a new story, one where love defied logic and curses became blessings.